Ranger found a dwelling inside a giant oak. Who lived there shocked him. Ethan had always loved the forest. Every morning, before the sun rose fully, he would lace up his boots, grab his ranger's hat, and step into the quiet world of trees and wildlife. To most people, the forest was just a place to hike or escape the city, but for him, it was home in every sense. He knew the paths, the sounds, and even the smallest details of the trees as if they were old friends. He had been a forest ranger for over 10 years, and every day brought new surprises, though nothing had prepared him for what he would find that morning. It was a chilly winter morning, with frost glittering on the leaves and a thin mist rolling between the trees. The birds were quiet, and the only sound was the soft crunch of Ethan's boots against the frozen ground. He followed the usual path along the old oak trail, a section of the forest known for its ancient and unusually large trees. These oaks were enormous, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches stretching high into the sky. Many of them had been standing for hundreds of years, surviving storms, fires, and the changing seasons. Ethan always felt a sense of awe when he walked among them, as if he were in the presence of something timeless. As he walked, his eyes fell on a particular oak that looked different from the rest. Its trunk was wider, older, and somehow more majestic. Its bark was rugged, with deep grooves and knots that seemed almost like a natural sculpture. But what caught Ethan's attention was something strange at the base of the tree. There was a hollow large enough for a person to step into. He paused, his curiosity instantly piqued. He had seen hollows before, of course, but they were usually homes for small animals like squirrels or owls. This one looked different. It was too large, too neatly shaped, almost like someone had made it that way. Ethan took a few cautious steps closer. He could see that the opening was darker than the rest of the forest floor, shadowed and mysterious. A cold shiver ran down his spine, not from fear, but from the excitement of discovery. He bent slightly to peer inside. The hollow was larger than it appeared from the outside. There was enough room for a person to stand upright. At first, all he saw were shadows and the faint outline of roots twisting along the walls. But then something made him freeze in place. There was a soft glow from what looked like a lantern. Ethan's heart raced. He had stumbled upon something he had never expected to see in all his years in the forest. Signs of human life. Carefully, he stepped closer, making sure not to startle anyone. He saw a small pile of firewood stacked neatly against the wall, a few rough wooden shelves, and what looked like a tiny bed made from blankets and leaves. Someone had made this hollow their home. The thought was almost unbelievable. Who could be living here? How long had they been here without anyone noticing? And most importantly, were they safe? Ethan wanted to investigate further but knew he had to be cautious. He did not know who lived here or whether they were friendly. He decided to leave for now, returning to the ranger station to gather some supplies. He thought about the hollow all the way back. The forest was full of secrets, of course, but this felt different. It was not just an animal burrow or a natural formation. It was a carefully constructed dwelling, made with care and attention. Whoever lived here had taken the time to make it comfortable, to create a small world inside the hollow of a tree. The next day, Ethan returned, bringing a small flashlight, a notebook, and a thermos of coffee. He wanted to explore the hollow more thoroughly, but still with respect and caution. He approached the oak quietly, aware that someone might be inside. The morning sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on the forest floor. As he peered into the hollow, he saw even more details than before. There was a tiny kitchen area made from a flat wooden surface on which small clay pots rested. There were utensils carved from wood, carefully arranged. A small pile of food, preserved in jars, sat neatly in a corner. The bed looked soft and inviting, with blankets folded carefully on top. Everything was orderly, clean, and well kept. Ethan took careful notes, sketching the layout in his notebook. He noticed other items as well, a few books, some old journals, and a small stack of papers with sketches of trees and animals. It was clear that this was someone's life, created with love and intention. The person who lived here had made a home in the forest, completely self-sufficient and private. Ethan was amazed. He had expected to find evidence of wildlife, maybe a temporary shelter, but this was something extraordinary. Someone had chosen to live entirely in harmony with nature, away from society. He spent hours observing from outside the hollow, watching for any signs of the resident. He did not see anyone that day, but he noticed footprints around the entrance, suggesting that someone had recently moved through the area. He also saw smoke rising from a tiny chimney built from branches and clay, a sign that the resident had made a fire recently. Ethan was fascinated and a little nervous. The forest was full of mysteries, but this was a living mystery, someone hiding in plain sight, surviving and thriving in the heart of the woods. Over the next few days, Ethan returned several times, always careful to respect the hollow and its occupant. He began to notice small details that made the place even more remarkable. There were hand-carved decorations on the walls, little figures of animals, and symbols etched into the wood. There were also practical touches: a small drainage system to keep water out, a storage area for firewood, and a place to hang tools. The resident had thought of everything, creating a tiny, efficient, and beautiful home inside the tree. Ethan could not stop thinking about the person who had done all this. Who were they? Why had they chosen such a secluded life? One morning, as Ethan sat quietly near the oak, he noticed movement. A figure emerged from the hollow, moving slowly and carefully. Ethan froze, unsure of what to do. The figure was an elderly man with a long beard and clothes patched together from different fabrics. He carried a small basket of food and walked with a gentle, deliberate pace. Ethan watched in silence, feeling a mix of awe and apprehension. This man had lived here for a long time, completely isolated, and yet he seemed calm, peaceful, and confident in his surroundings. Ethan realized that he had stumbled upon a story far bigger than he had imagined. This was not just a curiosity or a rare find. It was a glimpse into a life completely different from his own. The man had chosen solitude, yet he had built a home full of warmth, care, and intelligence. Ethan felt a deep respect for him and knew he had to approach the situation carefully. He did not want to frighten the man or invade his privacy. He decided that the first step would be to observe quietly, to understand the rhythms of this unusual life before making any contact. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued his careful observation. He learned the man's routines, how he collected water from a nearby stream, how he tended to small plants and herbs, and how he used the fire to cook simple meals. The man was resourceful and skilled, surviving entirely on what the forest provided while leaving almost no trace of his presence. Ethan was amazed at the ingenuity and patience required to live this way. It was a life of simplicity, yet it was filled with subtle complexity and intelligence. Every corner of the hollow had a purpose, every object was carefully chosen, and every habit was perfectly adapted to life in the forest. Through all this, Ethan felt a growing sense of connection, even from a distance. He realized that living in the forest like this required a deep understanding of nature, a respect for its rules, and a willingness to embrace solitude. It was a life far removed from the rush and noise of the modern world, yet it was rich in its own way. Ethan began to see the forest differently, noticing small details he had never paid attention to before. The rustle of leaves, the patterns of animal tracks, the subtle changes in sunlight through the trees, everything seemed more alive, more meaningful. Ethan knew that his discovery was extraordinary. Few people ever encountered someone living like this, hidden in the heart of an ancient forest. And yet, he felt a responsibility to respect the man's privacy while also understanding the story he had stumbled upon. This was a life of courage, resilience, and harmony with nature. It was a story waiting to be told, but it had to be approached with care, empathy, and respect. As he walked back to the ranger station that evening, Ethan thought about what he had seen. He thought about the man's courage, his skill, and his choice to live apart from society. He thought about the quiet dignity of the hollow, the careful arrangements, and the life that thrived inside it. He knew that he had witnessed something rare and beautiful, a story of human endurance and creativity that few would ever believe. And he knew that this was just the beginning of a journey into understanding, friendship, and perhaps the remarkable story of the man who lived inside a giant oak. After the first shocking discovery of the hollow, Ethan could not stop thinking about it. The image of the neatly arranged dwelling inside the giant oak haunted his thoughts. Every time he walked in the forest, he found himself glancing toward that special tree, wondering about the person who had lived there in secret. The more he thought about it, the more curious he became, but he also knew that he had to be cautious. This was someone's home, someone's private life, and he had no right to intrude. Respect had to come first. One crisp morning, Ethan returned to the oak. The frost on the ground made the forest shimmer in silver, and the sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the trees. The forest seemed quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath along with him. Ethan moved slowly, careful not to disturb the natural sounds of the woods. He reached the giant oak and paused, looking at the hollow that had changed his view of the forest entirely. This time, he brought a small flashlight and a notebook. He had decided that he wanted to document everything he could observe without entering or touching anything. The hollow seemed different in the morning light. Sunlight fell gently across its opening, illuminating the smooth curves of the inside walls. Ethan could see the faint glow of the lantern from yesterday, though it was not lit. He noticed even more details than before. On one of the small shelves, there were jars with dried herbs and preserved berries. On another shelf, small wooden carvings of birds and woodland animals had been placed carefully, almost like decorations. There were tiny tools hanging on hooks, each one carved or shaped for a specific purpose. The bed, which had seemed simple at first glance, was made with precision. Blankets were folded neatly, and leaves were layered in a way that would provide both comfort and insulation. Ethan crouched a little to observe the floor of the hollow. There were no signs of mess or carelessness. Each item seemed to have a place, and the whole space radiated a sense of calm and order. It was clear that the person who lived here valued cleanliness, organization, and simplicity. Ethan made careful notes, sketching the layout in his notebook. He felt a strange mix of admiration and amazement. He had expected to find maybe an animal den or a temporary shelter, but this was far more than that. This was a home, created with care, skill, and patience. Someone had put thought into every detail, and that alone fascinated Ethan. Days passed, and Ethan began observing the oak more closely, trying to understand the rhythms of the life within. He started noticing subtle signs of activity. Small footprints in the soil suggested that the resident moved in certain patterns at specific times. He saw a faint trail of ashes near the fire area, indicating that a fire had been made recently. Occasionally, he saw small pieces of wood carefully split and stacked along the sides. It became clear that this was not just a shelter, but a fully functioning home, designed to support daily life entirely in the forest. Ethan also noticed something else. The hollow seemed to be adapted to the seasons. There were layers of moss and bark in some areas, likely to provide warmth during the colder months. Small ventilation openings allowed air to flow through without letting in too much wind or rain. Every part of the hollow seemed intentional, created not just for survival, but for comfort and long-term living. Ethan was impressed. He had seen people try to survive in the wild, but few had mastered the art of blending ingenuity with simplicity in such a thoughtful way. As the days went on, Ethan's curiosity grew. He wanted to know more about the resident, to understand who had chosen this life and why. But he also knew that approaching too soon could be dangerous. He did not know the person's temperament or health, and he did not want to scare or harm them. So he decided to observe from a distance, using binoculars and taking notes. He began to notice patterns in the resident's routine. Every morning, the person would emerge from the hollow carrying small supplies, perhaps water from a nearby stream or food collected from the forest. They would tend to small plants nearby, which Ethan realized were herbs and edible greens. Then, they would return to the hollow to prepare a meal. Ethan also noticed the residents' resourcefulness. They had made simple tools from branches and stones, carved wooden utensils for cooking, and even built a rudimentary drainage system around the hollow to keep water from seeping in. The ingenuity amazed Ethan. This was not just survival. It was a well-thought-out, self-sufficient life, created entirely in harmony with the forest. The more he observed, the more he realized how much skill, patience, and knowledge of nature were required to live like this. One evening, as the sun began to set, Ethan noticed smoke rising gently from the tiny chimney made of clay and sticks. The glow of a small fire flickered from within the hollow. He watched quietly as the resident moved inside, seemingly preparing for the night. Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, respect, admiration, and even a bit of awe. Here was a person who had chosen a life completely apart from society, and yet they had created a world full of order, warmth, and ingenuity. Ethan's observations became more detailed over the following weeks. He learned about the residents' habits, their resourcefulness, and their careful management of food and water. He began to imagine the challenges they faced: harsh weather, isolation, and the need to constantly adapt to the changing forest environment. Yet the resident seemed calm, almost serene. There was no sign of despair or struggle. Instead, there was a quiet strength and resilience, a life built on patience, observation, and respect for nature. During his observations, Ethan also started noticing personal touches in the hollow. There were small carvings of animals, delicate decorations made from natural materials, and even sketches of trees and landscapes. It was clear that the resident not only survived but also appreciated beauty, taking time to create small works of art in their home. Ethan was deeply moved. This person had found joy and fulfillment in the simplest things: a quiet morning, the sound of birds, the pattern of leaves in the sunlight. Ethan wanted to document everything he could without intruding. He carefully recorded each observation, sketching the hollow's layout, noting the patterns of daily life, and describing the small details that made the dwelling remarkable. He began to realize that this story was more than just a curiosity. It was a lesson in human resilience, creativity, and harmony with nature. The resident had created a life that was entirely their own, free from the distractions and complications of modern society, yet rich in experience, learning, and personal fulfillment. One morning, as Ethan observed from behind a tree, he noticed something unexpected. The resident emerged from the hollow carrying a small bundle of firewood. As they stepped into the sunlight, Ethan could see their face clearly for the first time. The resident was an elderly man, with a long beard, weathered skin, and piercing eyes that seemed to hold decades of wisdom. He moved slowly but confidently, every step deliberate and precise. Ethan froze, unsure of what to do. This was the moment he had been waiting for, yet he also realized that it required sensitivity and respect. Ethan decided to remain hidden, watching quietly as the man went about his morning routine. The elderly man seemed unaware of Ethan's presence. He carefully placed the firewood near the hearth area, checked the herbs and small plants he had cultivated, and then disappeared back into the hollow. Ethan felt a mix of emotions: relief, fascination, and a growing sense of respect. Here was a person who had chosen solitude, yet they had created a life full of purpose, skill, and quiet joy. Over the next few days, Ethan continued his careful observation. He noticed that the elderly man had a routine that combined survival with small acts of creativity. He carved wooden utensils, sketched plants and trees, and even wrote in a small journal that Ethan could glimpse from a distance. It was clear that the man had adapted to life in the forest in ways that were both practical and deeply personal. Ethan felt inspired by the man's resilience and ingenuity, realizing that there was much he could learn from observing someone who had truly mastered the art of living simply and harmoniously with nature. Through all of this, Ethan began to understand the deeper story behind the hollow and its resident. This was not just a case of someone hiding from society. It was a deliberate choice to live in a way that was self-sufficient, meaningful, and deeply connected to the natural world. The elderly man had created a life that was entirely his own, shaped by his skills, observations, and understanding of the forest. Ethan felt privileged to witness this, even from a distance. By the end of Part 2, Ethan had become more than an observer. He had become a student of this extraordinary life. Every detail of the hollow, every action of the resident, offered lessons in patience, resilience, and harmony with nature. Ethan knew that he was witnessing something rare, something that few people in the modern world would ever understand. And though he had not yet met the man face to face, he felt a growing sense of connection and anticipation, knowing that eventually their paths would cross in a story that would be both unforgettable and life-changing. Ethan had been observing the oak and its mysterious resident. For weeks now, every day he learned a little more about the routines, habits, and remarkable ingenuity of the elderly man who had chosen to live entirely in the forest. Yet, despite the fascination and curiosity, Ethan had never made direct contact. He knew that patience was crucial. He did not want to scare the man or invade his private world. But deep down, he felt that a meeting was inevitable, and that when it happened, it would change both of their lives. One early morning, just as the first light of dawn began filtering through the tall trees, Ethan approached the giant oak more quietly than usual. The forest was still, the only sounds being the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant song of a morning bird. He crouched behind a nearby bush, watching the hollow intently. The elderly man emerged slowly, as if sensing the quiet beauty of the morning. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, carrying the air of someone completely in tune with nature. He held a small basket of freshly gathered berries in his hands and moved toward a flat rock where he often prepared food. Ethan watched with a mixture of awe and hesitation. The man's appearance was striking. His long white beard brushed against his chest, his clothing patched but clean, and his eyes, sharp and deep, seemed to carry stories of decades spent in the forest. Ethan realized that this was not someone who had merely survived. This was a person who had thrived, finding meaning and purpose in solitude. Every small action, from arranging the berries to tending to a tiny plant nearby, spoke of patience, skill, and deep understanding. For the first time, Ethan considered making his presence known. He knew he needed to be gentle and respectful. Slowly, he stepped out from behind the bush, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "Hello," he called softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the man without startling him. The elderly man froze for a moment, turning his head sharply. Ethan could see surprise in his eyes, but also calmness. There was no fear, only curiosity. "My name is Ethan," the ranger said, taking a careful step closer. "I mean no harm. I am a forest ranger. I have been observing from a distance because I didn't want to intrude. I just wanted to know if you're okay." The man looked at him intently, studying Ethan's face, his expression unreadable. After a few long seconds, he nodded slightly. "I am okay," he said in a quiet, steady voice. "I have lived here for many years. I am used to this life." Ethan felt a wave of relief. The man was not hostile, and there was an air of dignity in his presence that commanded respect. He took another step closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I've never seen anyone live like this," Ethan admitted. "I didn't even know it was possible to survive here so completely. I've seen your home inside the hollow. It's amazing. You've done something incredible." The man smiled faintly, a small gesture that seemed both humble and proud. "My name is Samuel," the man said finally, as if introducing himself to someone who had entered a part of his life he rarely shared. "I have lived in this forest for many years. Long ago, I chose to leave the city. Life there, it became too heavy for me. I lost people I loved, and I lost my way. The forest, it gave me peace. It gave me life again." Ethan listened intently, fascinated by Samuel's calm, thoughtful voice. There was something about him that made the stories feel alive, as if the forest itself had shaped his experiences. Ethan asked cautiously, "You've been living here all alone? No one ever came to visit?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "I have had visitors long ago, but not for many years. I chose solitude, but not loneliness. The forest is my company, my teacher, and my friend. Every day I learn something new about the animals, the plants, the changing seasons. This life, it has given me everything I need." Ethan felt a deep respect for Samuel. Living alone in a forest, building a home in a hollow oak, and surviving entirely on one's own knowledge and skill, it was almost unimaginable for someone from the modern world. For the next few hours, Ethan and Samuel talked quietly, seated on a fallen log just outside the hollow. Samuel shared stories of how he had built the home, using natural materials and simple tools. He explained how he had carved the shelves, made the lantern from clay and oil, and created a drainage system to keep the hollow dry during heavy rains. Each story was filled with detail, demonstrating not just survival skills, but creativity and intelligence. Ethan listened in amazement, realizing that Samuel's life was a combination of art, engineering, and deep understanding of nature. Samuel also told Ethan about the challenges of living in isolation. Winters could be harsh, food was not always abundant, and illness could be dangerous without access to medicine. Yet, he had found ways to overcome these obstacles. He grew herbs for healing, gathered food from the forest, and learned to predict the weather by observing the clouds, the wind, and the behavior of animals. "Nature is not cruel," Samuel explained. "It has rules. If you respect them and learn them, it provides everything you need. I have never been hungry for long, and I have never been without shelter. The forest cares for those who care for it." Ethan was fascinated by the philosophy behind Samuel's life. It was not just survival, it was a way of living with purpose and balance. Samuel had chosen a path that most people would never even consider, and yet he seemed completely fulfilled. His eyes sparkled as he spoke of small joys, the sound of birds in the morning, the taste of fresh berries, the sight of a deer quietly passing through the trees. Every detail seemed significant to him, as if he had discovered a depth of life that most people missed entirely. As the morning turned to midday, Ethan noticed how Samuel moved with skill and efficiency. Every action seemed deliberate, chopping wood, arranging herbs, tending to small plants, all done with care and mindfulness. Ethan realized that this was a person who had mastered his environment through observation, patience, and practice. The hollow was not just a home. It was a reflection of Samuel himself, a blend of practicality, beauty, and harmony with nature. At one point, Samuel invited Ethan to step inside the hollow. Ethan hesitated for a moment, aware of the trust being extended. Then, with careful steps, he entered. Inside, he saw once again the incredible organization and care with which Samuel had arranged his living space. Every item had a place, every tool a purpose. The small kitchen area, the neatly stacked firewood, the bed carefully prepared with blankets and leaves, everything spoke of thoughtfulness and intelligence. Ethan felt a profound respect for Samuel, realizing that this was not just a man surviving, but a man living intentionally. They spent hours inside the hollow talking about the forest, life, and the choices that had led Samuel to this unusual home. Ethan learned that Samuel had a deep understanding of plants, animals, and the rhythms of nature. He knew which berries were safe to eat, which herbs could heal, and how to track animals without disturbing them. He had learned all of this through observation and experience over decades. Ethan could not help but marvel at the depth of knowledge Samuel possessed, knowledge that could not be found in books or classrooms, but only through living closely with the natural world. By the end of the day, Ethan realized that this encounter had changed him. He had expected curiosity, perhaps some intrigue, but what he found was something far deeper, a story of resilience, wisdom, and harmony. Samuel's life was a reminder that it was possible to live simply yet fully, to survive yet thrive, to be alone yet not lonely. Ethan left the hollow that evening with a profound sense of respect and a new understanding of what life could be when lived intentionally and in tune with nature. As he walked back through the forest toward his ranger station, Ethan thought about how rare this experience was. Few people ever encountered someone like Samuel, living entirely outside the norms of society, yet so completely at peace. He knew he had a story worth sharing, carefully, respectfully, and truthfully. But more than that, he had a lesson to carry with him about patience, observation, and the quiet strength that comes from living a life of purpose. After his first real conversation with Samuel, Ethan could not stop thinking about the encounter. The experience had changed him in ways he did not yet fully understand. He had gone to the forest expecting curiosity, perhaps even a sense of adventure, but what he found was something far deeper, a life completely different from his own, lived with purpose, patience, and harmony with nature. He realized that Samuel's life was a lesson, not only in survival, but in living intentionally and appreciating the world around him. Ethan returned to the giant oak many times after that initial meeting. Each visit was an opportunity to learn more from Samuel, who welcomed his presence cautiously but kindly. They would sit outside the hollow, talking for hours about the forest, life, and the choices that had led Samuel to this secluded existence. Ethan listened, as Samuel described the techniques he had developed to live independently. How he collected water from the stream without disturbing the ecosystem, how he stored food safely, how he predicted storms and weather patterns by observing the wind, clouds, and movement of birds. Every detail fascinated Ethan. One morning, Samuel led Ethan to a small area near the oak where he had planted various herbs. He explained how each herb had a purpose, some for healing minor cuts and burns, others for cooking, and some even for tea that helped him stay warm in the cold winters. Ethan watched in amazement as Samuel pointed out the delicate leaves, explaining their uses with precision. "Nature gives everything we need," Samuel said softly. "We only have to notice it and treat it with care." Ethan realized that this statement held more truth than he had ever thought. Samuel's life was proof that living simply and respectfully with nature could bring abundance and meaning, even in the most isolated conditions. Ethan also learned about Samuel's daily routines and habits. Each morning, he would rise with the sun, gather water, tend to plants, prepare food, and then spend hours carving small wooden tools, writing in his journal, or sketching the forest around him. He moved through his days with patience and care, aware of each step, each action, each breath. Samuel explained that this mindfulness was not just practical, it was essential for his mental and emotional health. Living alone in the forest could be lonely for some, but for Samuel, it was a life of peace, reflection, and deep satisfaction. Over time, Ethan began to notice subtle ways in which Samuel's life had shaped him. Observing Samuel had taught him to slow down, to pay attention to small details in the forest that he had once overlooked. The way sunlight filtered through leaves in the morning, the patterns of animal tracks in the soil, the sounds of birds communicating in the trees. Ethan began to see the forest as a living, breathing entity rather than just a place to patrol. Samuel's presence had a calming effect, making him more aware, more patient, and more appreciative of life in its simplest forms. One afternoon, Samuel shared a story that left Ethan particularly moved. He spoke of his life before the forest, of the loss he had endured, and the challenges that had driven him to seek solitude. He had lost family members and friends, felt disconnected from the noise and demands of city life, and eventually realized that he needed a fresh start, a life where he could find peace and meaning on his own terms. He told Ethan that the forest had healed him, teaching him resilience, patience, and the value of living in harmony with the natural world. Ethan felt a profound respect for Samuel's courage and wisdom. Choosing such a life required strength far beyond what most people could imagine. As weeks turned into months, Ethan and Samuel developed a quiet bond built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. Ethan never forced conversation or questions, instead allowing Samuel to share his stories and knowledge at his own pace. In return, Samuel began to show Ethan small techniques and secrets of forest living, how to identify edible plants, track animals without disturbing them, and even craft small tools from wood and stone. These lessons were not just practical, they were transformative. Ethan began to appreciate the depth of human ingenuity and the beauty of self-sufficiency in ways he had never considered. Ethan also saw the emotional and spiritual strength in Samuel's life. Despite years of solitude, he was not bitter, lonely, or sad. Instead, he exuded a quiet joy, a deep sense of satisfaction, and a profound connection to the forest. He celebrated the small victories each day, a successful hunt for mushrooms, a well-built fire, a clear observation of a rare bird. Every moment held significance. Ethan began to understand that happiness did not always come from society, wealth, or recognition. For Samuel, it came from living intentionally, with respect for himself, for nature, and for the simple rhythms of life. One day, Samuel shared a part of his life that surprised Ethan even more. He had kept a journal for many years, documenting everything he learned, observed, and experienced in the forest. It was filled with sketches of trees, birds, and animals, notes on medicinal plants, reflections on life, and even poems inspired by the natural world. Ethan was amazed. This man who had lived in solitude for decades had created a rich, thoughtful, and meaningful life, full of art, knowledge, and wisdom. Samuel explained that the journal was not for anyone else, but for himself, a record of a life truly lived. Ethan began to see the broader impact of Samuel's life. He realized that people often underestimate the value of simplicity, patience, and self-sufficiency. Samuel had created a world within the forest that was complete and balanced, a life that many people might never understand, but that held immense lessons for anyone willing to observe and learn. Ethan felt grateful for the opportunity to witness this, knowing that it would change the way he approached life, work, and even his own relationships. As the months passed, Ethan started sharing his observations carefully with his colleagues at the ranger station. He was careful not to reveal Samuel's exact location, respecting the man's privacy. Instead, he described the ingenuity, resilience, and harmony Samuel displayed, emphasizing the lessons about nature, patience, and human potential. His colleagues were fascinated, some skeptical, but all intrigued by the idea that someone could live in such a self-sufficient, mindful way. Ethan felt proud to act as a bridge between Samuel's secluded world and the curiosity of the outside world. One crisp winter morning, Ethan visited the hollow to find Samuel outside, stacking firewood for the colder days ahead. Ethan admired the way Samuel moved, every gesture deliberate, every action purposeful. They talked about the coming winter, the changes in the forest, and the adaptations needed to continue thriving. Samuel's wisdom shone through each word. He spoke of balance, observation, and patience. "The forest provides," he said softly, "but it also tests us. Those who are willing to learn to respect its ways can find abundance and peace." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of these words settle in his mind and heart. Over time, Ethan noticed something remarkable. His own life had begun to change because of Samuel. He approached his duties as a ranger with more patience and understanding, paying closer attention to the subtle signs in nature and valuing the small moments of beauty around him. He started appreciating life outside the forest differently as well, taking lessons from Samuel's intentional living into his interactions with others. The experience was shaping him as much as it had shaped Samuel's life within the hollow oak. Ethan also realized the importance of sharing this story with the wider world, carefully and respectfully. Samuel's life was a rare example of human resilience, creativity, and harmony with nature. It was a story that could inspire others to slow down, observe, and appreciate the natural world. But Ethan knew that it had to be done without disturbing the peace Samuel had cultivated over decades. He decided that the story would focus on the lessons and experiences rather than the exact location or personal details of Samuel's life. As the story of the man living in the hollow oak gradually became known, carefully, through Ethan's writings and reports, people were fascinated. Readers were shocked and inspired, seeing a life completely different from their own, yet filled with purpose, creativity, and joy. Many realized that happiness and fulfillment did not always come from wealth, social recognition, or busy lives, but could be found in simplicity, patience, and connection to nature. Samuel's story became a reminder of the possibilities that existed outside the conventional paths of life. In the quiet of the forest, Ethan often reflected on what he had learned. Samuel's life was a living lesson in resilience, wisdom, and intentional living. He had witnessed firsthand that it was possible to survive, thrive, and find peace in solitude, and that true happiness could be built through respect, observation, and harmony with the natural world. The story of the hollow oak, the ingenious dwelling, and its extraordinary resident would remain with him forever, a beacon of inspiration and understanding. By the end of Part 4, Ethan fully understood the significance of his discovery. It was not just about curiosity or adventure. It was about recognizing the value of a life well lived, a life built on wisdom, patience, and harmony. He continued to visit Samuel, always respecting his privacy and always learning something new. Each encounter deepened his appreciation for the forest and the remarkable human capacity to adapt, create, and thrive even in the most unexpected places. The forest, once a routine place of work and observation for Ethan, had become a source of wonder, inspiration, and reflection. And the giant oak, with its hidden hollow, stood as a quiet testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the beauty of living a life truly in tune with nature.